Good morning, everybody. Great to see you. And we have actually decent weather today, which is nice. So my name is Mary Grillo, and I am the chair of the SDMA Docent Guest Lecture Series. This is just one of the Docent Council programs in our work to foster a welcoming and inclusive museum experience through empathy-based learning, exploration, and conversation about the arts. We operate out of the SDMA, located in Balboa Park, which is the unceded land of the Kumeyaay Nation, and we like to recognize. I would like to recognize those who helped make this program possible, the museum staff who publicize our series through social media, B. Baratza, our docent chair, and of course, my partner in crime, David Miles. In addition, Doug McMenemy. Doug, can you stand or wave? There you go. Doug, our docent professional photographer, will be giving a post-lecture tour of the Abbott exhibition. So we encourage you to attend. And Marina, could you stand? Marina is going to lead you over there from here, because it's actually in our public gallery right outside of Panama 60s. Please remember to mute your phone. And there, of course, there'll be a question and answer period afterwards. So today's lecture is funded by an endowment from Don Stoddard in honor of John Welch, his husband and a beloved former docent at SDMA. John started as a trainee in 2011. And when asked for reflections on John, his docent colleagues all mentioned what a kind and gentle person he was. He was highly intelligent and always willing to help anyone with their research or practicing their presentations. He was very generous with his knowledge and his time. Above all, he was the consummate gentleman. And from what I understand from Marilyn Woods, a GQ dresser and incredibly handsome. Oh, Gwyneth? Hello, Gwyneth? Gwyneth? Suda and Carol are right there. Okay, well, let's see. Or is it Zoraida? It's Zoraida. Okay, sorry, Zoraida, I can't see. Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry about that. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Sarah Miller. Miller is a historian of photography and modern art, a professor of art history at Mills College at Northeastern University. Her scholarship focuses on the invention and contestation of documentary as a key concept in American photography. Today, Miller will explore how photographer Berenice Abbott's unique theory of documentary photography was shaped by her experience amidst Europe's photographic avant-gardes and her collaboration with American art critic Elizabeth McCausland. Miller will discuss what it reveals not only about Abbott's sophisticated photography and her analysis of New York's built environment, but also about 1930s contests over the very meaning of the word documentary. Her book, Documentary in Dispute, the original manuscript of Changing New York by Berenice Abbott and Elizabeth McCausland, was awarded the College Art Association's Alfred H. Barr Prize, as well as the Photography Network's inaugural book prize. She is also the author of contributor of Simplicity and Directness. A documentary was born from writing photography's history in the 1930s. There will also be a book signing right after our presentation today out in the lobby. And we invite you all to come out and meet our speaker and purchase a book. So let us welcome Sarah Miller.
Thank you so much for having me today. Especially thank you to the Docent Council for inviting me to speak today, and particularly Mary and David for their heroic efforts in handling all of the logistics. Thank you also to Rachel Jans, of course, for curating an Abbott exhibition in the first place and suggesting me as a speaker. You're actually very fortunate to have an exhibition right now of Berenice Abbott's New York photographs from the 1930s. And I say that because I think it's a body of work that is much less well known on the West Coast than on the East Coast, and for some reason always has been. Not just because their subject is New York, but I think because these pictures undertake their analysis of American society through a study of the built environment in a way that didn't resonate as strongly on the West Coast in the 1930s. Here in California, of course, what resonated more strongly in the 30s was photography that explored the idea of America through landscape, like Ansel Adams, or in another register, Dorothea Lange. But Abbott's mode was somewhat foreign to West Coast photographers and audiences alike. And to some degree, it remains so, despite her canonical position in modern photography. And I chose these two images to start because they're in your exhibition, so I hope that they look familiar already. So, nonetheless, I'm actually here to tell you that, as it turns out, virtually nobody has understood Abbott's 1930s photographs particularly well, even those who have long been familiar with them. And that's because the landmark book that presented her New York photographs to the world in 1939 was not the book she intended to publish. Abbott had worked on her series titled Changing New York since 1935, with sponsorship from the Federal Art Project, which was part of the larger Works Progress administration of the New Deal. Her photographs were quickly acclaimed thanks to her prominence in New York photography circles, her various roles as a teacher at the New School, a member of the Photo League, a prominent advocate of New Deal arts funding, and a writer about this emerging phenomenon called documentary photography. In 1937, she had already had 2 exhibitions at the Museum of the City of New York. Selections from this series have been published in major newspapers and Life magazine, as well as national photography publications. So in 1938, the commercial publisher E.P. Dutton contracted with the Federal Art Project and the Federal Writers Project to produce a book showcasing a selection of Abbott's Changing New York photographs. They did so because they wanted to sell it to the millions of people who were expected to visit the 1939 New York World's Fair. And I really appreciate that we are on the grounds of a World's Fair here, so that you all can remember that in the early 20th century, World's Fairs were a really big deal. So Dutton also commissioned Elizabeth McCausland, a well-known art and photography critic who was also Abbott's romantic partner, to write the text, providing the 2 women with an exciting opportunity to collaborate, something they had long sought. So here I'm showing you the dust jacket of the published book on the left. Ironically, a designer at Dutton made it from a detail of the photograph on the right, a photograph that the publisher cut from the book at the very last minute. The full image perfectly encapsulates Abbott's ethos of the past jostling the present, and her delight when the primitive resists the modern in the cityscape. But you would never know that from the brick wall detail that survived on the book cover. The book that appeared in 1939 looked nothing like the book the women had planned together. First, Dutton rejected the women's design proposals and their ideas for a running text. And here I'm showing you a very early sketch on the left where McCausland envisioned photos of New York's many bridges strung together like a film strip, a device that she borrowed from her study of avant-garde European photo books. Then Dutton imposed a requirement of 1 caption text per photograph instead of a running text. on facing pages. So you see the layout of the published book on the right. And they also insisted on a very uniform boring layout. Later on, Dutton would also go on to demand rewrites of McCausland's caption text so drastic as to leave them unrecognizable, and proceed to cut a number of Abbott's chosen photographs. Complicating matters further, officials with the Federal Art Project insisted on vetting the image selection for politically sensitive material, while they also permitted other photographers to plagiarize Abbott's compositions or other books put out by the Federal Writers Project. Abbott was outraged when she discovered that her ideas had been copied in the 1938 Federal Writers Project publication, New York Panorama. So the entire process was marked by meddling, censorship, redesign, reinvention, and by a series of bitter disputes between authors, sponsors, and their publisher over the nature and purpose of documentary photography. With the publisher's suppression of Abbott and McCausland's ideas, one of the 30s most unusual, intriguing, and rigorously theorized versions of documentary photography was lost for decades. So when I discovered this original 100 caption manuscript and other documents by Abbott and McCausland that made clear their intentions for the book, it was really a revelation. I saw immediately that it was intended to be a manifesto about Abbott's practice of interpreting the city through photography, as well as a training manual so that readers might learn to emulate that interpretive practice themselves. And of course, I asked, why would the publisher reject this? As I researched, it became clear that the editorial contest over the manuscript was, on one hand, a disagreement over the nature and purpose of documentary photography, and on the other hand, a contest over photography's uses to tourism and urban experience on the eve of the World's Fair. I realized its implications were also bigger, at least for those of us who are photo historians. I saw that it could shift our understanding of the term documentary photography and its central role in the art and culture of the 1930s. So a few years ago, I used that manuscript to reconstruct changing New York as it could have been. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the detective work that went into that process and the revelations that it afforded. Previously, most scholars had taken the term documentary for granted as an explanation of the work. And of course, they only had the published work to refer to. Of course, Abbott used the term herself. The project was sponsored by the WPA. And on its surface, the published book does seem to appeal to the kind of social and environmental reforms that we associate with the ideal. The unpublished manuscript allowed me to realize that was all wrong, because it revealed that Abbott's version of documentary was entirely unique, at least in the States, and not intended to function as testimony to Depression-era suffering. What interested her were the invisible values and forces propelling the destruction and rebuilding of the city. Shelter on the waterfront is a good example. For Abbott, this photo was not about the plight of the unemployed or the misery of their shack, per se. Instead, Causland's original caption, the one that disappeared, would have led the viewer to see the physical combat and the improvised shelter of the dispossessed, juxtaposed with capitalism's skyscrapers, which seem imperious and sort of absurdly skewed all at once, as a compositional metaphor for what she called the vertical and horizontal conflict of the city. And that idea that the built environment encodes the city's invisible social and economic conflicts is really key. So before going further, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of my book so that you can picture how I structured my project and what resources I tried to provide. So part one reconstructs the book, Changing New York as it could have been. And this is a sample page spread. So it's based on the unpublished manuscript of 100 discrete caption texts by McCausland that was written in the spring of 1938. And that manuscript resides in the archives at the Museum of the City of New York. Abbott's photographs are arranged according to that sequence, the sequence of the captions in the manuscript, and paired with McCausland's original text. And underneath that, I also reproduced the caption and sequence placement used in the published book of 1939, so that the contrast between the two texts and the placement of the book is immediately evident. Or I indicate if a particular photograph was cut by the publisher, and an example is Church of God in Harlem on the right. So we had to make some creative decisions in designing this reconstruction, because the women did not leave a design mock-up for this version of the text manuscript or the text and image manuscript. And when I say we, I worked with this amazing editorial team at the Ryerson Image Center in Toronto, which is now called the Image Center at Toronto University, which holds one of Abbott's main archives. So we decided to bleed the images off the sides of the page and place them in varied positions on the page, because we knew that Abbott and McCausland wanted a more dynamic, modern layout than the one they got. But at the same time, we reproduced those captions of the published book so that this could also function as a print record. Part two. Another example of the layout page with all of the captions intact. Part two reproduces some amazing archival documents that I unearthed that shed light on the women's earliest plans for the book. It's pretty much. And those include sketches, design sketches, initial ideas for a sort of akin to a screenplay or a prose poem for a running text that would have gone through the entire book instead of the ones that the publisher eventually required. And you can see on this early prospectus already that McCausland is pitching this as the photographic excavation of the archaeology of contemporary life, giving eyes to 7 million workers. There are also letters and memos in this section that illuminate how bitter and extensive the revision process was. Those memos indicate battles over practically every photograph in the book, as well as the larger concept and format of the book. And in this section, I also included the introduction originally drafted by Henry Russell Hitchcock, a well-known architectural historian, which was rejected by the publisher as too esoteric. And then the last section of the book consists of scholarship. Julia Van Haften, who is Abbott's biographer, and Gary Van Zandt of the MIT Museum contributed this wonderful little essay about Abbott's multiple archives and her 30-year partnership with McCausland. And then comes my much longer text about the development of Abbott's documentary theory, about the original manuscript and its implications for an expanded history of American documentary photography. As well as what I see as the context, really, or the context of the World's Fair for a contest over the relationship between photography to urban experience at the end of the 30s. In a 1935 application to the Guggenheim Foundation, McCausland argued that the great democratic photo book did not yet exist in America. The photo book in which images and text would not only interact to produce a meaning that was more than the sum of its parts, but would also generate an active engagement on the part of the reader. So it makes sense that the first thing to strike me about the original manuscript was McCausland's ambition of training the viewer to read Abbott's photographs as both deliberate compositions and critical statements. And what a difference her language makes to viewing Abbott's photographs. So let me outline several of the key elements of McCausland's original text that made me see the changing New York photographs in a new light. This photograph, Brooklyn Bridge at Water and Dock Streets, would have come first in their manuscript. And McCausland's caption introduces the essential theme of visibility and invisibility. Her insistence that invisible tension is the thing being photographed here, and that the city itself is composed of invisible forces manifest in the relationships of visible things. Meanwhile, the photograph itself announces that Abbott's documentary photography won't just replicate the guidebook cliches of introducing the tourist to New York at the southern tip of Manhattan's financial district. Instead, she's framing that view of the financial district through visual obstacles that speak of change in progress. She's defamiliarizing the landmark bridge and compressing 4 distinct moments of architectural form and technology into a single plane that show us that the present consists of their simultaneity. McCausland's words here help the reader to see that the meaning lies in composition, and composition engenders a new kind of inspection. And note that the word inspection is actually painted on this 19th century tobacco warehouse. It's literally an imperative that would have opened their book. I also noticed a language of shock effects and a genuine delight in the irrational cityscape that provides them. So the montages afforded by the city could precipitate shocks to the consciousness, as McCausland had it, and the photograph can freeze and sustain that shock as an image. Eldest foray into the language of surrealism, but it also alerts the viewer to many such images in the planned manuscript, like chicken market. The third key element I noticed in McCausland's text was its unexpected attitudes towards the concept of change, which she often frames through a trope of vanishing. Sometimes she's critical of the technocratic reforms being carried out in the city. She tells the reader, for example, that street vendors like this one on the left are vanishing due to the city's new hygienic regulations and increasing tendency toward economic concentration. On the right, her original caption for Gay Street criticizes the removal of that block's historically Black population, turning the whitewashed walls into a metaphor for the whitewashing of so-called rehabilitation. McCausland constantly alerts the reader to the causes of vanishing, specifically so that Abbott's photographs aren't mistaken for picturesque, which both of these photographs otherwise could be. And last, I noticed numerous captions mourning the varieties of experience that will be lost in a future, better planned city. Like the shadowscapes and the chance encounters under the L tracks that will soon be torn down, or the romance of New York's oldest barbershop window. Note the reflection of the horse-drawn cart moving out of the frame in the pink photograph. Again, really thematizing vanishing. Both of these images, by the way, were cut by the publisher and do not appear in the final book. So as I mentioned, there's a lot going on here that does not conform to the usual expectations about documentary photography during the Great Depression. And obviously also McCausland's messages were often very much contrary to the kind of improvements that the WPA programs were bringing to New York City in the 1930s. So then I had to ask myself, was the WPA sponsorship kind of a red herring that had led people to see this book in a totally different light? What is Abbott's theory of documentary and where did it come from? As it turns out, document and documentary were not yet popular terms when Abbott returned to the US in 1929 after 7 years in Europe. In fact, she herself helped introduce them and theorize them within the American modernist vocabulary. Her concept of documentary was definitely an outgrowth of her activities in Europe in the 20s, of which there were two crucial features. One is her own education and participation in the milieu of avant-garde photography, especially surrealism. And the other is her acquisition of the archive of the French photographer Eugene Atget after his death in 1927. We can't really imagine the history of photography without Atget as one of its lodestars now, but that is largely thanks to Abbott's tireless work on his behalf. Between 1928 and 1931, she traveled back and forth between New York and Europe several times, focusing on getting Atget's work published and exhibited on both continents. As a consequence, she immersed herself in the writing that was produced about Atget by authors affiliated with surrealism and the new modes of cultural criticism in Europe. That literature by figures like Robert Desnos, Albert Valentin, Pierre McGarlin, and Walter Benjamin, among others, often explored how the non-art photograph, what they called the document photograph, could disclose a hidden reality beneath the visible, or speak of the invisible crimes underpinning modern civilization. In Europe, the so-called new photography of the 1920s was strongly shaped by this interest in the disruptive anti-art qualities of the so-called document. It was also shaped by the idea that photography was a medium uniquely suited to dialectical image making. A lot of avant-garde photo critics speculated that photography's formal properties, black and white, negative and positive, made it capable of synthesizing opposing forces into a third term, something new, and especially a flash of perception in the form of an image that has political ramifications. This is just on the left, an example of one of the many publications in the sort of little avant-garde magazines that took up Atget's photographs posthumously. It sort of provided a vehicle for surrealist and other avant-garde writing on the implications of photography. So Abbott brought both of those threads back to the US with her. By the time the manuscript was written for Changing New York, McCausland was describing Abbott's theory of the documentary image with the phrase dynamic equilibrium. Repeatedly, her text explains how Abbott has brought opposing forces into dynamic equilibrium. A meaningful composition of found juxtapositions, using the special properties of photography. And again, here we have a photograph that refuses to function as a reformer's report. Poverty's victims are nowhere visible in this photograph. Instead, the caption asks the viewer to question, actually the photograph and the caption, ask the viewer to question the very expectation of exposure through a dynamic of concealment. The prying eye travels along the clotheslines into a deep receding space, only to be rebuffed by a riot of laundry, which I see as empty containers for the expected human forms, filling and structuring the field of vision. McCausland's text narrates how the eye is drawn to and diverted from the building in a movement controlled by the photographer. She's telling us that dynamic equilibrium is a dialectical mode of composition, but it's also the photographer's creation of tension between seeing and knowing. Gunsmith and Police Department is one of my very favorite examples, especially considering its inclusion in a book destined for tourists. It proclaims that documentary photography, again, doesn't just affirm the predictable landmark. Rather, its task is to reveal how invisible institutional forms of authority and violence structure the landscape. Abbott went to considerable lengths to achieve this worm's eye view that makes the gun aim directly into the distorted police headquarters. No doubt, many others had seen and photographed the sign, McCausland writes, but the conception is the artist's unique contribution of significance. Also notable is what McCausland's caption does not say, and Abbott's vantage point avoids. The street between the gunsmith and the police station here was New York's perp block. So not only do Abbott and McCausland reject tourism cliches, they're also rejecting the local stereotype of what is to be seen and judged deviant here. By directing the viewer up and away from, quote, guilty individuals to their institutional determinants. As a synecdoche for the entire proposed book, I think this photograph makes explicit how the apparent serendipities of the built environment can be made to reveal the operation of power that shapes it. Meanwhile, a kind of dual experience of terror and delight both implicates the viewer in those operations and encourages the viewer to apply this interpretive practice to the cityscape herself. And I noticed, sort of clued in by some of these captions and photographs that I just showed you, I noticed that when selecting pictures for the book from the larger Changing New York archive, which ended up being comprised of more than 300 photographs, the women chose those that really highlight the photographer's point of view in constructing the meaning of juxtapositions. So you can consider how that works here, where Abbott puts two modes of monumentality into conversation with each other. This could be a subject that you'd encounter in a more conventional guidebook, right? The monument. Save for Abbott aggressively calling your attention through her vantage point to how she made the statue of an 18th century politician confront the 20th century phase of power on Wall Street. Abbott, all of the formal theories and techniques of the image that I've been discussing were marshaled to a specific mission. And that mission, one of those missions, is to change how photography represents history. She often said that documentary photography does not just record old things because they are quaint or because they are monuments. Rather, documentary is a pictorial means of analyzing the present through the past, and thus exposing the present to be a product of social and ideological forces. Her project was titled Changing New York, not Old New York, because to her, documentary's job was analyzing this process of change. And that's why McCausland's original text for the book was so didactic. She wanted to amplify the analysis embedded in Abbott's images, but she also wanted to show what viewers could learn by adopting Abbott's way of seeing. She kept insisting that change is not inevitable or natural, rather it's social and political. In her caption for the photo on the left, for example, McCausland explains that this modern trinity only arose through a zoning exemption for a powerful corporation, while it was Abbott's wide-angle lens that brought them into a relational image of modern power, a relationship that literally couldn't be perceived with the naked eye. The Victorian Children's Home on the right was one of McCausland's favorite examples when she was arguing with the publisher. She kept having to explain that it wasn't inevitable or natural for this eclectic architectural marvel to be demolished in order. But in all honesty, very few of Abbott's audiences in the 1930s understood this mission. Reviewers did typically describe her project as recording old New York before it passed away and disappeared. And so they often missed the deeply critical nature of Abbott's juxtapositions or her formal meditations on the conditions of visibility or vanishing. So as a historian, I felt it wasn't enough to just reconstruct the book that Abbott and McCausland tried to create. I also wanted to understand why Dutton would impose such a drastic alteration. And I wanted to understand what context and perceived demands the publisher was responsible. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, this book was commissioned in advance of the 1939 World's Fair. So what became obvious first was that Dutton expected to produce a book for tourists. The fair was truly the talk of the town from 1937 onward, and it was expected to attract some 50 million visitors over 2 years. And I should say that tourist books were undergoing a revolution of their own in the 1930s, from text dominant to photo dominant. These newly visual books, and in fact, they were called view books, nonetheless drew on long established patterns of the New York City guidebook. So they would often replicate the same landmarks and sites, the same paths through the landscape. They would update them with jaunty modern photographs. And in fact, some of Abbott's early photographs are included in this 1934 book called This is New York, which did exactly what I just described. So clearly drawing their expectations from recent view books like this one, the Dutton editors kept asking for more predictable monuments and other cliches, while complaining that Abbott's photographs were cold, redundant, inexplicable, lacking human interest, and not picturesque. I don't know how well you'll be able to read this, but in this particular memo, McCausland offers a point-by-point rebuttal to such accusations, in which one of her very best lines is, "Sherry Netherland does not look sumptuous. Its prices are sumptuous. The point of picture was to show absurd and inconsequential relations of unrelated objects. Fountain's Fanny, very important from aesthetic point of view." She also explains things like scenes of Chinatown were omitted because they are cliches. Whereas the Syrian restaurant should be kept in because it is, quote, part of the city that no one ever sees. For the same reasons, Dutton editors cut 14 photographs out of the original 100 that they considered controversial or esoteric, like Father Duffy, still wrapped up on the left, or the image of the Harlem pastor that I showed you earlier. They were replaced with photographs of glamorous modern skyscrapers, like the Daily News building on the right, or with more picturesque subjects like tugboats. Equally consequential, Dutton resequenced the photographs according to a classic New York City guidebook pattern, starting at the southern tip of Manhattan, moving north through picturesque neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, and then up to modern midtown skyscrapers and the mansions of Upper Manhattan. In my research, I realized that I figured out that starting in 1937, a number of commercial view books, like the one I'm showing you here, which was titled New York, the World's Fair City, pun intended, took that old formula and added a new ending: departure from Manhattan for an imagined journey to the World's Fair in Queens. Here you see the look back at the Manhattan skyline at dusk that ended many a commercial view book. But in this case, you would turn the page and then be introduced to this fair that doesn't exist yet and its vision of the future. The fair's theme was building the world of tomorrow, and its main exhibits like Democracy, which were already being discussed in public by 1937, would encourage leaving the old, dirty, dangerous city behind in favor of the rationalized regional planning of the future. All the fair literature was very serious on this point. The future of civilization and the future of democracy depended on this vision of progress. And on the cusp of World War II, any message about the survival of democracy and the cultural models that can support it were heavily freighted. So when I studied Dutton's resequencing, I realized that it adopted the itinerary of that 1937 book I just showed you. South to north in Manhattan, and then out to Queens, through Brooklyn to Queens, finishing with a look back at Manhattan. And it did so in a way that took the reader on a path of progress toward the World's Fair. The reader is carried along in the published book on a journey to the future in Queens, over the Triborough Bridge, no less, a Robert Moses showpiece of the city reshaped for mobility with WPA funds. And along the way, the reader passes decrepit slums and other primitive oddities that will soon be demolished in the name of progress, or by the time the book appeared in 1939, had already been demolished. So whereas Abbott and McCausland had planned for 100 discrete moments of analysis and revelation, moments that depended on that compact, layered, diverse, irrational, and often contested cityscape, the published book maps the passage from past to future with a momentum that feels linear and inevitable and destined to leave the old city of contrast behind. The captions in the published book, now rewritten by WPA research staff, almost always reinforce this idea of progress. They are full of statistics about who built what and at what cost, and comments about substandard buildings being replaced by modern improvements. Even when describing quaint emblems of old New York, they simultaneously hail the imminent extinction of primitive, unhygienic customs like the tin peddler. The published captions make it seem like Abbott's pictures are evidential reports supporting arguments for enlightened reform. And in the process, they convey such affirmative evidence to be the task of documentary photography. Abbott and McCausland protested to their publisher during the revision process. The book was never designed to be a guidebook. It was planned as documentary material about, quote, a city no one ever sees. That was in all caps, city no one ever sees. To them, a documentary photograph posed a question about the invisible forces shaping the visible environment. It didn't supply an answer or affirm a consensus or ratify the visible as natural. A documentary book, moreover, would instruct viewers on the apprehension and embrace of contradiction for its own sake. It would finally be the great democratic photo book that McCausland had dreamed of, the book that did not yet exist. Watching from afar as Nazi Germany weaponized art to create a culture of conformity, Americans were, by the end of the 1930s, debating quite fervently the question of what kind of art and culture a democracy needed. Did it need an image of perfection to aspire to, or did it need an art that cultivated skills of dissent and inquiry? Did it need to treat history as a glorified past, or allow it to be a subversive and unpredictable force? The World's Fair took up the great urban planning conversations of the era, and those conversations increasingly promoted homogeneous, family-centered planned communities as the image of health and the future of civilization, while condemning the city as over-concentrated, dirty, chaotic, sterile, and the past. Abbott and McCausland, as a queer couple and as avowed leftists, perceived that the fair's notion of progress was predicated not just on leaving the city behind, but on the eradication of difference. Their planned book was aimed at World's Fair visitors as much as Dutton's was, but on different terms that reveal a gulf between them on the definition of documentary photography and its cultural task. In contrast to the Fair's vision of the future, their book of Changing New York was planned to demonstrate photography's power to make meaning of and to induce engagement with the city's diverse and densely layered fabric. Indeed, their documentary photography, with its image theory of dynamic equilibrium, depended on the city of contrast for generating its social and political critique. But the city was also indispensable in their eyes for its capacity to accommodate difference and to accommodate the human imagination to difference. In that sense, Abbott's unique version of documentary was also intended to cultivate the skills and sensibilities the women considered essential to living in a modern democracy: openness to the unknown, the embrace of contradiction, and the thrill of living among strangers. Thank you.
Sure. I have two questions. The first one is, it seems that this book, she was the only photographer for this book. And how come the publisher, I mean, why choose her if he was going to end up changing all the pictures anyway? And the second question is, once this project got started and all these changes were happening, why didn't Abbott quit?
So the publisher just wanted to, capitalize on the new popularity of view books, right? The photography dominated, book for tourists that they expected to sell millions of copies to World's Fair visitors. And they wanted to capitalize on Abbott as a modern photographer, somebody who's well known in New York, whose works have been, shown but not yet very widely published. I think they just, with their total misunderstanding of Abbott's own mission, they thought, here are some sexy modern photographs that will enable us to put out a unique book that nobody has, that nobody's seen before, capitalizing not just on view books, but on this new trend called documentary photography. And clearly they just, they just had no comprehension of what Abbott and what Coslin really wanted to do.
Something like today's politicians sometimes using music, rock and roll music, totally incorrectly.
Exactly. And the question of why they didn't quit is a really interesting one. I think there are a few reasons. One is that despite their prominence in New York art circles, they were not. They needed, like, this would have been, Abbott's biggest exposure ever, right? She did not come from money. She was penniless, even while she was sponsored by the Federal Art Project. This should have been, it was, but on the wrong terms, really the thing that made her career. And secondly, as women, photographers were not yet respected as artists, and photographers aimed in the 30s primarily for publications. It was still so rare to see a photography exhibition in a museum, especially photography as art in a museum. A book was the goal, right? So they were going to do anything to get this book out. And McCausland even left her name on the text, author credit, even though those texts hardly represent her words at all. Because both of them really needed this for their careers, even though it ended up, I think, it compromised their vision, and it made them incredibly famous at the same time. It was a real, you know, bargain with the devil.
Go ahead, go ahead. So just to push a little harder, it's hard to not think that there wasn't sexism and homophobia involved here, and yet they were chosen as two women, photographer and writer. How does that square out?
I think that there was sexism in the way that the publisher handled communications with them and felt utterly entitled to sort of override their vision.
And saw their vulnerability in the moment, maybe.
Yeah, and saw especially their financial vulnerability. The homophobia part, I'm actually less clear on. They were honestly like a sort of a well-known power couple within New York's modernist art circles. Those circles were much smaller then than they are now, but I think what's hard to untangle is the sexism relative to the fact that photographers were not yet respected as artists in their own right. And so what Abbott was fighting for more than anything was for photography to be to be able to establish the terms on which photography could be understood as a modern art. But photographers were still mostly understood as doing work for hire. And so, you know, for instance, in this book, which contains photographs by people who are now luminaries, Walker Evans, Abbott, Margaret Fork White, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the editor just did whatever they wanted with these photographs. It's 1934. They overwrote them with captions, they cropped them, they montaged them, you know, they appended their own text, their own messages. Photographs just weren't yet autonomous art objects. And so to me, it's always been really hard to untangle the sexism from the fundamental disrespect that was also shown to photographers in this moment when publishers still had all the power.
Is there any possibility that the publisher actually thought he was doing them a favor? Well,
yes, in the sense.
not to justify it, but just and it's hard to put yourself in the mindset at the moment.
Yeah, I think that the publisher thought they were doing Abbott a favor and McCausland a favor in a very self-dealing way. I would say that the longer the arguments went on and the more bitter they became, I mean, this memo involves McCausland's rebuttal to a complaint about every single one of 100 photographs. The longer it went on, probably Dutton did not think that, you know, anybody was doing anybody any favors here. But eventually the book did manage to see the light of day.
And what about even the Federal Art Project and the Federal Writers Project leading to plagiarism?
Why would that happen? Yeah.
Is that?
I remember where that. Right. It's even more mystifying why the Federal Art Project would actually throw Abbott under the bus. And again, this is a really complicated political situation. Abbott and McCausland had become very prominent advocates for public support of artists during the Depression. And they were pressured to continue that advocacy for the sake of the Federal Art Project. The Federal Art Project was always under attack from conservative politicians. It was seen as a kind of particularly vulnerable project staffed by a bunch of leftists that could endanger the Works Progress Administration as a whole. And so Abbott and McCausland were under incredible pressure to not say that the Federal Art Project was failing them in some way. And what happened was the Art Project and the Writers Project both maintained offices in New York, and they No, this was essentially considered, the photography was considered work for hire by the government because it was sponsored by the Federal Art Project, and they kept prints of Abbott's photographs in the office and they let other people see them. And so Abbott and McCausland discovered in 1938, when Panorama came out, that the staff had let other photographers copy some of her compositions. And you can tell it's not, they didn't just actually reprint Abbott's photograph. They sent somebody else out to take the same juxtaposition, but from a slightly different angle. And I mean, and Abbott's, Abbott wrote heartbroken, outraged letters to the New York administrator of the art project saying, how can you do this to me? It completely undermines my reputation as an artist and everything that I have fought for on behalf of photography. And the administrator told her that she should be quiet for the good of the Federal Art Project in order to not endanger, its political standing. Rachel.
I just wonder what the government's policy was with regard to copyright. I bet it's a work for hire. The government would have retained that, and in the sense
there is no copyright on work for hire for the government.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so the artists have no control over it, and I could go out and take the same picture tomorrow. It's just an idea, and you can't copyright an idea anyway.
Yeah.
If I tried to if I printed her work, that would be different. The other thing I remember, I think I'm remembering correctly, is that speaking of the WPA and its political sort of hot potato status, Tamayo, who was Mexican, came to New York in the 30s and latched on to the WPA Artist Project. And somebody found out that he was on the rolls and was not a citizen. As you might say, in a New York minute, he was kicked off.
Mm-hmm.
So again, as you say, that seems to me to square with this kind of political bias. And then, of course, the government, Roosevelt administration, wants to tell the best story. So they're going to have the political angle to it, and the artists are secondary.
Yeah. Well, and especially when, the great majority of WPA money was going to infrastructural improvements in Abbott's eyes, right? And so the Federal Art Project is a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the larger WPA, and I don't think anybody really foresaw that an artist might be at odds with the larger program. But yes, you're right. There is no copyright on work for hire done for the U.S. government, and so that, of course, also undermined Abbott's ability to position herself as an artist and to position documentary photographs as unique expressions of artistic creativity rather than just copies of the world.
So I'm curious about the contracting of this book. Did Dutton contract with the government for the pictures of the book? So they originally had their own idea of creating a travel log, basically, for the World's Fair. And then there was the contest, basically, between the photographers and their original intent with the photographs. And that's where the contest came into play.
Yeah, I think that documentary photography was a very new and a new thing, newly popular, newly prominent in the media, partly because of other, government-funded programs like the Firm Security Administration, photographers, slang, events, etc. And so Dutton, I think, looking for a commercial opportunity, approached the Federal Art Project and Federal Writers Project, hoping to both capitalize on this kind of fresh modern art while producing something that would be saleable to World's Fair, anticipated World's Fair visitors. I don't know how much of a vision Dutton had before approaching the Federal Art Project about the opportunity, but obviously once Abbott and McCausland started submitting ideas, Dutton realized that they had a very different idea of what they wanted the book to be.
the, the government.
Thank you, Mary.
Well, I was wondering if the photographs had already been made and before the federal
Yeah.
project and were in existence before Dutton contracted for the book. Okay.
Yes. Abbott was undertaking an exploration of New York's built environment, actually ever since she got back from Europe, so starting in 1930-ish. But she gained federal art project sponsorship for it in 1935. So most of the photographs in the book were made between 1935 and 1938. So the photographs already existed, which is how the other folks got their hands on them to plagiarize them. And I think the problem with photographs is that they're slippery, right? I mean, McCausland's text was an effort to pin them down for a particular agenda. But the photographs themselves, you know, it's not surprising to me that a publisher could see them serving one agenda, the tourist agenda, and at the same time that Abbott and McCausland had a completely different vision for the agenda they might serve. I think that's part of the battle over documentary photography in the era of its emergence, is that there was no one definition. So I think this dispute sort of reveals to us that people wanted different things out of photographs. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for unpacking, excuse me, unpacking all of this. We have to remember it's almost 100 years ago. The disrespect for photography was huge. Getting a book out was kind of like what would now be social media. Exhibitions were few and far between, and whether you were a man or a woman, you were really disrespected. And there was no copyright. I have a hard drive that runs harder now because I'm older, but I believe it was the 70s with ASMP, right, that the copyright first came out. So everyone was scrambling, and we have on our coast, you know, the West Coast, Dorothea Lange, which is a precursor to documentary. We have Imogen Cunningham, who was more the art. We have Ruth Bernhard later. We have all of these wonderful women photographers on the West Coast. I came today because of the influence of Adjay to Berenice Abbott. The storefronts are one, the surrealism, the humanity, the dream world, just seeing the juxtaposition of real A and real B of the reality in New York. So I want to celebrate what you did, but it would take hours to unpack all of the changes in the medium, as you all have a camera in your pocket called the phone. So thank you for what you've done today and bringing us that history of almost 100.
Well, thank you. I will say briefly with regard to Adjay, the Abbott's relationship to his work and his influence was also incredibly complicated, right? She rescued the archive. She toted it around for 30 years before she could convince the Museum of Modern Art to acquire it. What seems so obvious to us now was not obvious to anybody except for a very small circle of modernists in Boston and New York who really embraced not just Adjay, but the surrealist or avant-garde kind of theories of photography that were built on Adjay right around the time of his death. These are not ideas of Adjay's own making, right? They're really modernist ideas about photography. Photography's ability to become a modern art by emulating the non-art look of the document, right? And so we have two different histories of documentary photography. One is Abbott's, which was also very much shared by Walker Evans and people who they worked with in common. And then there's this sort of very different version that was developed through the Farm Security Administration in the 1930s, Lang in particular. You know, they're absolute contemporaries and they were in dialogue. And so I think that's part of the reason that it's been so hard to see Abbott's documentary as different from the Farm Security Administration version, which was so much about advocacy for environmental reforms. And so much about kind of testifying to the suffering of the Great Depression. So it's been hard for Americans to see that Abbott's version of documentary came from somewhere else.
Just one follow-up on the copyright issue. A lot of the books that I referred to on Berenice Abbott indicated she had copyright on many photographs. I didn't notice if it was all of them or just part of them. But is that explained by what was mentioned earlier, that copyright of photographs is a later thing?
Photographs have been copyrightable since the late 1800s. However, the exception is that work for hire for the government of all kinds cannot be copyrighted. So all of Abbott's work prior to 1935 and post 1939 is copyrighted. And that copyright passed to an entity called Commerce Graphics, because Ron Kurtz bought Abbott's archive in the late 70s or early 80s when she really desperately needed the money, and the photography market was really taking off, sort of in terms of collecting and museum collecting. But he saw an opportunity to capitalize on it, and she was getting quite elderly and needed the money. So Ron Kurtz created this organization called Commerce Graphics, which bought most of her archive, and he acquired the copyright. So now if you publish anything except for the Changing New York photographs, you still need permission from the estate, which was managed by Commerce Graphics. And that's the collection that went to Ryerson University in Toronto, which included a bunch of amazing papers, which is what allowed me to do this project.
Thank you for such a stimulating talk. I have so many questions, but in comments, but I'm just going to ask 1.5.
Okay.
It's just incredible the way that you've opened up the invisible as one of her motivations for this project, and it has allowed me to see her later work. Like, oh, well, she's still doing that, or she was still doing that later, which would be her science photographs, which is such a literal way of capturing the invisible forces. So I was wondering if you could talk about that. And then also, given that this book didn't come out the way that she anticipated, can you talk about how her ideas might have been transmitted, possibly through teaching or publishing, or her other manuals that she published that reflect this very open modernist approach to document?
Yeah. Let me take the second question first. Let me go back to Abbott herself here. Despite the fact that the women were pretty much ordered not to protest, they did, in fact, put out several publications in the early 40s that, at least to their closest colleagues, functioned as corrections of the record. So Abbott, both of them were really much sought after as writers on photography. And Abbott was also very much sought after as a teacher on large camera technique. And so certain editors who knew what had happened gave them opportunities to publish. McCausland put out an article about photographic books, in which she explained her theories of photographic book design, and at least at one moment pointed to the layout of Changing New York as an example of what not to do. Although she did not admit that her text had been rewritten. She actually never really admitted that in public because she sort of needed to save face there. So there's an article out there explaining, she herself was an amateur typesetter and book designer starting in the late 20s. And she had started her career as an art journalist, but also as a bookmaker. So she published that article about her ideas on good photographic book design. Abbott published an article called Photographing the City, which sort of was a retrospective manifesto, sort of disguised as a instructional article about technique. Abbott was also commissioned to do a book on view camera photography. And so within her textbook, that eventually went through several editions and is really acclaimed. Within that textbook, she manages to get in some commentary about the kinds of amazing things that you can do with a large format view camera to bring sort of disparate elements of the scene into relationship with each other through camera adjustments, tilts, etc. It's a phenomenal instrument. It's nothing like a 35mm camera. You are creating the image very much in a view camera if you know how to use it. So all of those things, I think, slightly helped to correct the record, but only, by 1942, like, this is old history, and World War II was going on, and honestly, like, Abbott and McCausland were really struggling to remain relevant. So sort of these publications on technique and Abbott's continued teaching at the New School were kind of as good as it was going to get for a forum. In terms of her science photography, so for those of you who don't know, Abbott had this phenomenal career, yet constantly underpaid, in which she invented a lot of devices for photographing scientific phenomena, which is indeed a continuation of her interest in photographing the invisible. And because of those, she was recruited to MIT. And in the 50s, she was an employee of a group at MIT that was essentially writing the new standard physics textbook. And she had her own photography lab at MIT where she engaged in all of these experiments to build devices and come up with new techniques for photographing physical phenomena that are invisible to the naked eye. So that's a whole nother chapter of her career that is completely fascinating. And again, like, a real struggle to be a woman photographer and a technical expert in this strange milieu of MIT physicists in the 50s, right? Yeah, and I'm not an expert on the scientific photography, but I will say, for those of you who are interested, the MIT Museum holds the archive of that work and has done several shows and several publications about it, and it's just like an incredible whole nother chapter.
Steve, this was our wrap up.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
A little research on this. So in the late 50s, MIT put together this high school physics curriculum called PSSC. And Abbott provided the photos for the textbook, and it was a comprehensive program, textbook, teacher's guide, everything. And I had PSSC physics. And so I came across Abbott photographs, although I had no appreciation, or actually I have no recollection. But anybody who took PSSC physics became or should have become acquainted with Berenice Abbott. And I don't know how many other people. Oh yeah, it was a terrific program, and it was so self-contained that I had an English teacher who taught it, He knew, you know, as much physics as I did, but he would read from the material, and it was a true program.
Well, thank you. All right, so I want to thank Sarah for this in-depth and really incisive view of Abbott's photography. I think it adds a whole new level of understanding for all of us. And if you would like to deepen that knowledge, we have a book signing going on in the lobby right after this. And of course, Doug is awaiting you for his tour at the Public Gallery in Panama 66. But please let us thank Sarah Miller for her exceptional presentation.
And that was such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And if you're interested in the tour, Marie